So good morning, and a big thank you to the organizers for giving me the chance to participate in this inspiring conference. Now, over the last 2 days, we heard a lot about systems and how to combine systems or how to scale up systems, possibly to a global level. Now, today I would like to take a little bit a different approach, or the opposite approach, and take a complicated question, a complicated problem, and try to capture the gist of it and simplify it and scale it down to a very manageable level. And so in particular, I would like to talk about two behavioral experiments dealing with public goods. One of them will deal or is framed around climate change. And so in that context, which is kind of a recurrent theme in this conference, I came across this nice cartoon. It kind of outlines a timeline of the attitude of public opinion towards climate change. And I guess this discourse between public opinion and researchers is another theme of this conference. Now, if you look at how this public opinion changed, and in the last panel referring to 2005, the person just is totally relaxed and stating that, well, the effects of climate change will be really bad, but they won't occur during my lifetime. And so I think it's still 10 years on, and I think we could add a fifth panel. And probably the message there would not be much different from what we have here, but maybe at least the person would not be quite as relaxed as he is in this panel here, in the light of the increasing frequency of extreme weather events over the last couple of years. So what I would like to start with is just by outlining a typical public goods experiment. It's pretty much in the sense that Carl was discussing in the previous talk. So typically we have a small group of participants, or let's say 4 or 6 players, and they engage over several rounds. They get some play money, they get an endowment that they can invest in each of these rounds. And they know that every token that or every monetary unit they invest in a common pool will be multiplied by the experimenter. For example, it might be doubled. And then this multiplied public resource will be distributed equally among all participants regardless of their contributions. And so this creates a conflict of interest that characterizes all social dilemmas, in a sense that for each individual of the group, it would be preferable if everybody invests fully into the common pool, because then everybody walks away with twice the initial endowment that they were receiving. On the other hand, each individual is tempted to withhold its contributions, because every dollar, if I decide to invest into the common pool, then this dollar is going to be doubled by the experimenter and then divided among all participants, let's say divided among all 4 participants, so I get only 50 cents back. That's quite a bad investment. And so for my personal profits, I would decide not to invest at all. But then if everybody argues in this way, then no one is able to increase their initial capital. And that's the characteristics of this conflict of interest. Now, if we carry out these kind of experiments, it's another figure that Carl already showed, then we see that initially people are willing to invest at least a significant share, typically about half of their endowment, or half what they can spend in every round. And then these investments, they quickly decrease over time and level out at a very low level if we keep continuing here, or even disappear entirely. Now, this kind of conflict of interest is extremely common in nature, in all kinds of animal or human societies. Now, here I want to focus on human interactions, and I think humans are champions in creating social dilemmas, but they're also fairly good at solving them, although in many cases a bit more cooperation might still be preferable. So these kind of conflicts of interest or social dilemmas, they arise in the context of social welfare states when it comes to healthcare or pension plans, unemployment or infrastructure, and many other contexts. But another theme of this conference is related to global sustainability when it comes to managing natural resources such as clean air, fresh water, fisheries, and of course, our climate. And so this conflict of interest has been studied in many different disciplines and is known under many different names. I will refer to it as public goods games, or in the context of climate change as collective risk games. The two are extremely closely related to each other. So seeing that investments into public goods decrease over time, we may ask the question, well, how can we resolve this problem? And probably the oldest solution that was proposed is that individuals just need to repeatedly interact with each other. This offers the possibility that they can condition their behavior based on previous interactions. And that leads to the notion of direct reciprocity, following the principle that I help you and you help me. This can be extended if we introduce a reputation of individuals, then it's not necessary that the two individuals need to interact repeatedly, but we may condition our behavior based on the reputation of other individuals, which leads to the concept of indirect reciprocity. Then we can further extend this by considering optional interactions or voluntary participation. Carl addressed this before, or we can add a spatial dimension where neighbors are more likely to interact with each other. But in the following, I want to focus on this last point, that we can introduce reward and punishment. Now, as Carl was mentioning already, punishment is a powerful promoter of cooperation. And again, it's the same experiments that Carl was referring to. We can see that immediately, once punishment is allowed, immediately the contributions go up and level off at very high contributions. But at the same time, we have this second order conflict that Carl was discussing quite in detail, where rational players would not pay to punish anyone, but then if everybody argues this way, nobody punishes, and then the public good is not secured anymore. Fortunately, this is not what happens in experiments, because even if we extend this to much more rounds, the contributions will stay up high if we have this possibility of punishing. Now, what I want to pursue in our set of experiments is what happens if the rewards or the punishment are not of a monetary nature. And one extremely powerful form of punishment is, of course, shaming. And here I've just shown a couple of examples of shaming in medieval times. And it's actually pretty sad to see how inventive individuals were just to humiliate other members of the community. Fortunately, the times of the pillory or the stocks are over, but shaming, actually, in times of the internet, shaming has experienced quite the revival. So again, here are a couple of examples of shaming as it's practiced currently in the United States. One example is in New York City, also in California. Restaurants, they have to display the result of their previous health inspection. And so that signals to the customers whether it's a clean environment. And it actually did help to significantly reduce the number of hospitalizations based on foodborne illnesses. Another example is from the state of California. They publicly list the top 500 tax delinquents. And so you can look up their name and address and all kinds of information, how much they owe to the state, etc. And that also led to quite a significant return, or encouraging individuals to actually pay their taxes, because they get notified before they are actually put up on this list. Other examples, because shaming is really a kind of a controversial issue. Other examples where it didn't work quite as well is this case here, where a woman was caught stealing from Walmart and then sentenced to stand in front of Walmart wearing this sandwich board for a whole week. And after this week, they interviewed the manager of Walmart, and he stated that during this week was a significant drop in thefts in that store. And that, of course, ironically kind of raises the possibility that the store manager actually might employ a poor guy to stand in front and kind of serve as a reminder not to shoplift. Another example is from Ohio, where individuals that are caught for drunk driving, they get a different kind of plate. They get a yellow plate so that they are easily identified as potentially dangerous drivers. But actually under the most affected age group of teenagers and people in the 20s, these yellow plates, they're known as party plates. And so again, maybe that shaming did not quite work out. So what we wanted to do is to find out how does shaming and honoring work in an experimental setup. So we had pretty much the same setup as I explained before. We had groups of 6 players that were interacting over 12 rounds. They got $12 endowment, and they could invest $1 in each round, or withhold the investments, of course. All individuals were completely anonymous, and the total investments were doubled and equally distributed among everybody. So, as in the example I gave before, each invested dollar just returns, or in this case, just returns 33 cents to the investor. But if everybody always fully invests, the students go home with $24. Now, we were looking at 3 treatments. And of course, that was communicated to the students. So in the first treatment, in the honor treatment, the students knew that after 10 rounds, we would reveal the true identity, the true names of the 2 top contributors in the game. In the second treatment, the shame treatment, of course, we didn't use those terms, but in the shame treatment, we would reveal the identity of the 2 individuals that contributed least. And in the control treatment, nothing happened after the 10th round. Now, an important detail is that in this setup, all the individuals, all the participants in the experiment were recruited from the same course early on in the term. And so that ensured that even though the interactions were anonymous, they knew they were from the same cohort of students. And once they knew their names, they actually would know for the rest, at least for the rest of the term, who the top contributors or the least contributors were. So now, if we look at the results, then in the control treatment, we see kind of a very similar kind of decline as in the previous results, so no surprises there. But then in the honor treatment, we see that, first of all, the investments start quite a bit higher, and they remain significantly higher over the entire duration of the game. For the shame treatment, we observe pretty much the same. And we were actually a bit surprised by this. So, in fact, there's no significant difference between the shame and the honor treatment. We would have expected that the shame treatment would be much more efficient in promoting contributions or encouraging contributions to the public good, but that didn't turn out to be the case. However, in either treatment, the increase in contributions to the public good are highly significant compared to the control. And there is an interesting difference between the shame and the honor treatment, and that actually only refers to the 2 rounds after the exposure. Because after the exposure, the people that were shamed, they did not contribute anymore. But the people that were honored as the highest contributors, they kept contributing. So pretty much in either case, after this moment of truth, the individuals would live up to the expectations that the community had towards them. Then, after the experiment, we asked the students to briefly summarize their strategy they were pursuing. This gave us some time to prepare the payouts. And one of the important observations was that people did understand the problem at hand. And so some were trying to avoid being honored or shamed. They just wanted to remain anonymous. Other ones were actually aspiring to be the top contributor. And maybe a pretty common and sad kind of strategy is like this one summarized down here that says, I stopped giving because other people are stupid and selfish and don't know how to do math. Now, another significant portion indicated some kind of random strategy. Now this, I think, reflects that these kind of decisions, though the game is fairly simple, the decision is actually pretty hard. And so I think that reflects that some people were just overwhelmed with the task at hand. And then there were special kinds that like use deception. So they said, well, make sounds with coins and envelope before handing in, and then contribute nothing. And a very nice and a bit disillusioning feedback was by one of the participants in a control that really understood what this experiment was all about. And this participant wrote that, but we were all in the same class for the greater good, with a frowny face. So another example of successful shaming brings me to the issue of climate change. And this shaming campaign was targeted towards Victoria's Secret, which is a big chain of lingerie stores in North America. And they were sending out 1 million catalogs every day. And those catalogs were produced from unsustainable sources. And so kind of a grassroots movement was formed, Victoria's Dirty Secret, and they managed to increase the pressure onto Victoria's Secret to change their policies. But to some extent, you could of course understand why Victoria's Secret didn't care about sustainability, because global warming would of course allow them to show off their product. Now, the public goods problem that's captured by climate change is a particularly tough one, because it poses unique challenges in the sense that there's only one game. And this one game is mandatory for everybody because it has a global scale. And it requires significant investments to make any change. Moreover, there are huge inequalities among the participants, inequalities in terms of economic background, so financial means, or in terms of the impact that climate change may have. So there might be winners and losers. Coming from Canada, I assume that we are more likely to be on the winning side, but people from Bangladesh, they're looking at very dire times because of global warming. Another aspect is that we have to make these investments now in order to mitigate climate change, but we can only reap the benefits much further down the road in the future, and maybe it's not even going to be our generation that profits from the future. Now, this kind of discounting is very natural, because future benefits may not be realized, or we may not live to enjoy them. So we wanted to know what this discounting effect has on investments in public goods. And so it's a very similar setup as before. We had 6 players, 10 rounds. They had 40 euros investment, and they could invest 0, 2, or 4 into the common pool. The task here, because it's slightly different than in the public goods situation, the task here was to raise 120 euros. If they managed to raise that amount, so that's an average of 2 euros per round per participant, then they would successfully avert dangerous climate change. And if they reach that threshold, then they would receive an additional reward of 45 euros. All the money that they did not invest in the common pool of those initial endowment, they could keep. However, if they didn't reach the target, then the 45 euros would be forfeited with a chance of 90%. Now we were interested in the effects of discounting, so the temporal delay, and so we were looking at 3 treatments. The first treatment, the payout, the reward, if they reached the threshold, was paid out the next day. In the second treatment, it was paid out after 7 weeks, and in the third treatment, the investment was not paid out at all, but instead it was invested into planting oak trees that would sequester carbon and so actually make a contribution to climate change. Now if we look at the results, then we see in the first treatment, so there's essentially no temporal discounting, then we see that seven groups out of 10 managed to reach the target. If there was a delay of 7 weeks, then the number of groups dropped to 4 that managed to reach the target. So that kind of is reminiscent of intragenerational discounting, just the regular temporal discounting. But if it was about planting trees, none of the groups managed to receive or meet the target. Now the difference between the difference between the two first treatments, so for intragenerational discounting is not significant, it's just a strong trend. But if we compare to intergenerational discounting or the planting of the oak trees, then the difference is highly significant. Now this is a fairly bleak result, but I just want to point out that one group almost made it, and even though many of the groups failed to reach the target, there were still rather significant investments made towards mitigating climate change. Now, if we look at the type of contributions that people were making over the different rounds, then we see, interestingly, that if we just focus on the fair individuals that actually paid the 2 euros every round, then there's not much of a change between the 3 different treatments. It's a much bigger change when we look at the people that were free riding, at the selfish, so 0 investments. They increase quite a bit for treatment 2 with 7 weeks delay, and even more dramatically if it was about planting trees. Now it's important to see this point here. So there was a kind of a last-minute effort in putting in 4 euros by altruistic people, and that's responsible that at least those 4 groups were making the threshold. This is not seen here, so here it's probably that people were simply giving up earlier on. So that brings me to my conclusions, and I would like to conclude with a quote from Thomas Schelling from 20 years ago, when he said that to invest resources now into reduced greenhouse emissions is to transfer consumption from ourselves, whoever we are who are making these sacrifices, for the benefit of people distant in the future. And so with our experiments, we have shown that intergenerational discounting poses a severe challenge to cooperation in public goods interactions. And in particular, in climate investments, we have the situation where short-term investments investments into climate change have a long time horizon. If we make short-term investments, then we cannot mitigate climate change. And so short-term profits, they can arise only from defection, but we need to have a much longer time horizon in order to successfully deal with climate change. And there, maybe adding punishment, reward, honor, or shame might help to promote the contributions to mitigate climate change. Now, even though none of the groups managed to reach the target in treatment 3, because there was only a 90% chance that the reward was lost. Actually, in 2 cases, the reward was still paid out, which translated that we have planted 260 oak trees as a result of this experiment, and maybe one of them will develop into a symbol like the major oak from Robin Hood's home. So that brings me to the acknowledgements of all my collaborators. Jennifer Jacquet is the lead author in both of these studies, and she actually just came out with a book, Is Shame Necessary? New Uses for an Old Tool, which puts forward and it elaborates on quite a number of ideas that I presented here. Thank you very much.